In hearing a little bit about this group and how this works, I was told it was kind of an informal research discussion. And in the spirit of that, it is fine if folks want to make comments or ask questions as we go along. You can even raise your hand, I guess, through Zoom. And this can be kind of a dialogue here. So first off, let's see here. So I don't have any conflicts of interest or disclosures. As I'm going to discuss, this work has been supported by a wide range of institutes and foundations and other groups over the course of time. But the goal for the talk is pretty simple. I just want to discuss the study that I've been working on for the last 15 years and that I've come to enjoy and love. And I think to do so, the first thing I need to do is to introduce you a little bit to the area that the study comes from. This area out in Western North Carolina near the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, okay? So the study itself takes place in 11 counties in Western North Carolina. You can see it's in the far reaches there, abutting Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina. And it's a rural area. Two other features of it is that right there on the border with Tennessee, you've got Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which is where the study gets its name, and it's still the most visited national park in the country. So this is a rural area, but there's a lot of visitors that are coming through on a regular basis. Okay. And as you would expect, it's a beautiful area. This is one of those morning pictures where the clouds are rising and you kind of get the sense of why it was originally called the Great Smoky Mountain Study. Here's another one. I can't say that I took these pictures, but it's a beautiful area worth visiting. My first introduction to the area came when I was a college student. So this is, I don't even know what year, I don't want to say what year, but a long, long time ago, a couple of friends from college and I went down here and backpacked up Clingman's Dome, which is the highest point on the Appalachian Trail, right smack dab there in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. So the area, as you can gather, is rural and it's geographically isolated in a lot of ways. It's made up of a lot of small towns and there's a lot of attachment to one's town. It also is an area that has higher than average rates of poverty, particularly in families that have children under the age of 6 years old. So you have a lot of children that are kind of coming into the world already with little adversity. Can anyone tell me where this figure might have come from? Any guesses? Okay, this is from the 2016 election. And this is a map of how the different counties in North Carolina went. So you see, if you focus on these 11 counties out there where GSMS is located, this is Trump country. And a lot of these counties went for Trump 70%, 80% or more. Right in the middle, we have one big blue county, and I'm sure you can guess what that is. That's Buncombe County, where Asheville is located. I think that one was closer to 55 or 60%, okay? This area is also part of Appalachia. This is kind of a picture of the extent of it from Pennsylvania all the way down to Alabama and Georgia, and we're in this south central part of Appalachia. So this already kind of brings up a sense of what this place is like. And it's an area that's dealt with a number of crises over the last 5 years or so. So most of you are, I'm sure, acquainted with this idea of the diseases of despair, the idea that we're seeing kind of rising levels of kind of premature mortality. Folks are in their 50s and 60s dying of suicide, of alcohol, and of drug-related causes. And Appalachia, and particularly this area of Western North Carolina, is one of those areas that's been hit hard by both the overall diseases of despair, but in particular by the opioid crisis. So this is this was pulled together from comparing all Appalachian counties to non-Appalachian counties. You can see that there's higher levels on a per capita level for mortality related to these different diseases. And it's specifically the case that overdoses are what is explaining a lot of this increased risk in this area. We're going to get more into that as it relates to GSMS in a little bit, okay? It's not all rural. You do have Buncombe County. This is a picture of Asheville at night, 90,000 people. So it's kind of has mixed urban and rural as well. And it's also home to the largest private residence in the United States still. I'm sure a lot of you have been out here to the Biltmore, right? Okay. And very strong culture and a lot of artists out there. It's known for its bluegrass music. It's also known for a number of authors that live out there and write about the area. And if you're interested in a late summer reading list, these are a couple of recent publications by authors in the area that are about the area, including this one on the right, which is about, which is written by one of the members of the Cherokee tribe that I'm gonna be talking about. Okay. So I mentioned that we have the Qualla Boundary, which is the home of the eastern band of the Cherokee Indians, which is kind of located in the middle of this area. And here it's described as Welcome to Cherokee Indian Reservation. It's actually not a formal reservation. This land was purchased by the Indians, put into land trust, and they have tribal sovereignty over the land. So they're responsible for schools, for law enforcement, and they have their own hospital. There's about 16 Cherokee that live in the area, and the area is 56,000 acres. So it's a large area in the middle here, and one where we've been able to do a lot of interesting work. The tribe itself, as you may be aware, is home to the Harrah's Casino, which opened in 1996, a few years after the study itself started. And this has been a source of tourism and a lot of revenue for the tribe in general. The tribe has invested those dollars back into the community. They've also taken half of the revenues from the casino and they've dispersed them to the members of the tribe so that each member of the tribe, man, woman, and child, gets a bit of the profits. Back in the 90s, it was about $6,000 to $9,000. Most recently, I think it's about $12,000. So you can imagine if you're a family, 2 parents, you're each getting this $12,000. The money for the children is put into a trust until they reach adulthood. But that can make the difference between kind of living in poverty and having additional resources to invest in your children. And we've leveraged that for a number of interesting studies over the years. It's also a tribe that's done remarkably well in terms of kind of handling this recent epidemic, which North Carolina has, I think done an okay job with, but maybe not as impressive as the tribe. They began mass testing by March 15th. They closed down businesses and their borders a week later. So this is while a lot of other states were still trying to figure out what to do. They sent their employees home and they paid their essential employees double time. The police, the hospital workers, and mandated face coverings. And because of that, they've been a lot more successful than North Carolina as a whole of keeping the rates of COVID down. This is a community with a strong network and they've dealt with a lot of crises over the years. So they were ready to leverage that in the case of COVID. Okay. And that's actually a picture from out in Western North Carolina as well. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the study itself that comes out from this area. So it was described in the first paragraph of the very first Great Smoky Mountain Study publication in 1996 as a study designed to examine the development of, need for, and use of mental health services in child and adolescents in an area of southeastern United States. The idea at its very start was that this was going to be about psychiatric epidemiology. We simply did not know much about children in rural areas, their risk for mental health problems, and their likelihood of getting any help for that problems. So what was the gap between the number of kids that had mental health problems and received services for them? For some types of diseases that we study, we can go into our clinic and we can look at the data there. For mental health problems, because so many of the people that have these problems don't show up in clinical settings, it's important to do these studies in the community. And that's exactly what the PIs decided to do. So this is Jane Costello on the left, and this is Adrian Engold on the right. And they started the study back in 1991, although data collection started in 1993. And then Jane kind of held on to the reins for 25 years running this and making it the study that it was. Okay? So the idea from the very beginning was that it would have a very strong epidemiologic foundation. And so they wanted to collect a representative sample of children in this area. And there was 12,000 children overall, and they used a household equal probability design to get at this representative group. And when they first screened them for mental health problems so that they could enrich the sample for children that were at risk for mental health problems, and then also add in a random subset of those that weren't at high risk for mental health problems. But by doing it in this way, we're able to apply sampling weights that are inversely proportional to the likelihood of their being selected, and therefore estimate prevalences of mental health problems within this community, okay? On the right here, they received a supplement to also collect information on children from the Qualla Boundary. There was 450 such American Indian children, and that's the term that they really prefer, and the tribe, American Indian. And we recruited all of those children, 349 participated. So the total sample size is 1,420 overall. And these are pictures of a few of the participants a few years ago now that have been part of the study. This is when they were young adults. As I will tell you, they're now a bit older than that. They're in their late 30s, okay? So I was trying to think of a way to kind of characterize the study in a glance. And as you're kind of preparing for a talk like this, you end up finding interesting ways to procrastinate. And so one of the ways that I did it was to put together this timeline and history of this study over the course of the last 28 years. Because I thought it gave a really good sense of a number of the different transitions that the study has gone through, and also provides a lot of important information about the sample and how long they've been followed and how much information that we've collected on them, okay? So first of all, you can sense here that it started out as a study focused on mental health, and it was funded by NIMH. But we had NIDA coming on board early on, and for a lot of the young adult period, NIDA was really the primary funder of the study, up until much recently, where NICHD has come on board in the recent application on intergenerational effects of the study. So we're now studying the children of the GSMS participants at the same age as the original participants were when they started in the study. So it's transitioned across institutes, and now we're applying to NIA to add them to the mix again as well, okay? You can see back here in 1996, we had the first study publications and the casino opening up, and that provided an opportunity to do some really interesting science around this cash transfer that was made to all the tribal members. And over here, you can see the cohorts and their original ages back in 1993, and the way that inexorably they have aged like the rest of us and are now in their late 30s and early 40s, okay? Over the course of that period of time, we've collected 12,000 assessments on these 1,400 participants. 3,000 of those are on the Cherokee subsample, and the median number of assessments that we have on the participants is 9. So there's a lot of information that we have across this first 4 decades of their life, and in some level of detail, okay? The sad milestone on here was back in 2017 when Jane stepped away from the study. This was more of a process over time. She is now fortunately happily retired and in a rural area herself in Kentucky. So what were we interested in collecting information about? Well, the backbone of the study really was in this structured diagnostic interview called the Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Assessment, okay? And this was used to collect information, first off, about psychiatric status. So you collect information for individual symptoms about frequency, duration, onset, and cross-context stability so that you can diagnose folks with common psychiatric disorders. But it's much more than that as well. This was developed by Adrian Engel, who also started the study, and it really reflects his personality. It is incredibly detailed. it is a little bit persnickety and, also a little bit demanding. So there's information about the individual and their family history and their relationship with different family members, relationship with peers, their functioning within the school context. There's information about how their emotional and behavioral functioning is affecting their behavior in different important life domains, how it might be impairing their functioning at school or in relationships. There's information about service use across 29 different service areas. So if the person had a symptom of an emotional behavioral disorder, did they go out and get any services, and what type of services did they get for how long, and was this helpful for them? There's information about the burden of these emotional and behavioral problems on the child and on their family. And there's a detailed information about important life events along the way, the kind of things that we talk about now as ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences or traumatic events, and also non-traumatic events too. So we can understand in as much detail as possible the psychosocial context of their childhood. And we collected those interviews. They were done with the child and with one of their parents up to age 16. And then we've done an interview called the Young Adult Psychiatric Assessment, which is an extension of the CAPA, with the participants themselves since they were age 19 and most recently at age 30. In addition, we've collected detailed information on the parents' mental health. There really, from a very early point, was a focus on biological measures. So obviously height, weight, pulmonary function. We also have blood pressure as well. But importantly, from the very first onset, we collected blood spots. And so we go in with our lancets and we'd stab their thumb and get the 10 blood spots from them and then send them off to a negative 80-degree freezer to be stored for posterity. And we do this at each assessment. So we have repeated serial biological information, which is proven to be much more useful now than it would have been back in 1993, when there wasn't a whole lot you could do with them, right? Over time, we've been able to assay them for pubertal hormones, estradiol and testosterone, stress biomarkers like cortisol and DHEAS, inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein and EBV antibodies. And then also we've been able to genotype those samples on a genome-wide genotyping array, and also completed whole genome methylation sequencing on them as well. So a study that started out about psychosocial context has developed over time to also be about genomic risk and about epigenomic risk as well. Just one of the many transitions the study has gone through. We've also linked information on the individuals to education records, criminal records, juvenile justice, voting records, and health records as well. So we have kind of the different layers of information you'd be interested in. And also done geospatial coding and been able to link that up with census data so we can understand the context of these 11 counties a little bit better. So this is the obligatory small font slide with a number of the things that we assess that nobody is supposed to look at in a whole lot of detail, but it's just supposed to show you the breadth of information that we collect. And this interview is an extraordinary thing. I still go into it and find things that we studied that I didn't know that we collected information about. So for example, there's a whole section on having guns in the home, okay, that we collected. And now we're able to go back and look at that data and realize that over 50% of our participants grew up with a gun in the home. Many of them had access to the gun. Many of them owned their own gun. And then we're able to link that up with information about their current functioning to see if that sort of introduction to gun culture affects their current risk for gun-related crime and other important outcomes. So it's a treasure trove. And I am eternally grateful for Adrian for creating that wonderful interview. So just a couple of examples of the types of studies that GSMS has been and will continue to be. Psychiatric epidemiology, risk and resilience, pubertal development and mental health, ecological study of family in the community context, A lot of work on different sort of substance use and behavioral trajectories. There is this embedded natural experiment that occurred when this casino opened up and these cash transfers started to happen to members of the tribe, where we could study, did this extra money have any effect upon the child's functioning and on the parent's behavior in relation to the child, and was that a lasting effect? It's also been a story of how psychosocial experiences can become biologically embedded over time. And I already mentioned that this is a genetic study. So in terms of scientific impact, this has been an investigator-initiated study from the very beginning, and most of the work has been done by the primary investigative team. It hasn't been developed or funded at a level where it could have its own data dissemination group. So most of the lifting and analysis has been done by us. So there's been over 100 scientific publications. Importantly, these have been able to have an impact in important areas. So things like psychiatric epidemiology, service use and unmet need, development and risk for emotional behavioral problems, important exposures to life events like trauma and bullying, puberty, substance use, and adult outcomes of early experiences. And then more recently, trying to understand this construct of diseases of despair and how it relates to this particular point of area in Western North Carolina. So that's a little bit of background on the study, and it's highly likely that you might have a question or I might have missed something. So I think now might be a good time to give you a chance to grill me a little bit.
Bill, I'm wondering how much mobility there is in this community, sort of how many people over time, sort of as participants of your study have moved out, whether you follow those who leave the area or.
Sure. So
that's just a community study, yeah.
Right, so this is kind of that natural experiment you get when you follow any group for 28 years, right? So during that period, this is kind of going back to this earlier slide, but we've had close to 50 participants that have died at this point. And early on in young adulthood, a lot of that was related to kind of motor vehicle accidents that involved substances as well. And now there's a number of them that are related to opioid overdoses, which are still really endemic, particularly within the Cherokee sample. Overall, we've been able to retain over 80% of the original sample at the most recent time point. So wherever they go, and they've gone far and wide around the United States and around the world, we'll get in touch with them and we'll do our interviews by phone and anything that it takes to keep them within the study. A lot of them, fortunately, have stayed in the study area, but we follow them where they go and have been fortunate to maintain a lot of that original sample.
You have consent to link to their medical records?
Yeah. So you have to collect that using kind of the HIPAA consent form if you want to collect that information. And some of our participants are not as excited about giving us that inside look at their medical records. Interestingly, they're much more willing to give us their blood than they are to give us information about their health history. And maybe that's just because we got them primed early on and got them really comfortable with, bleeding for us on cue. But yeah. Others?
Hi, Dr. Copeland. My name is Naomi Duke. I'm faculty in the School of Medicine.
Sure.
Duke, new to Duke within the last 2 years. The question I have is just the intergenerational value strikes me. And I just wondered how much do we have about the parents' history? We have, I guess I can understand blood work from the respondents, but then also for their children now as they're sort of entering adolescence.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I was going to get into that a little bit more kind of going forward here. We have information on the parents. A large portion of the interview is also about themselves and their own functioning. And we've done kind of standalone kind of interviews of our participants' parents and collected saliva samples from them. We've never collected the blood spots from the parents of the participants that we've collected on the participants all along. So now there's kind of 3 generations. Our subjects are in their 30s. A lot of them, maybe around 60 to 65% of them are parents. So the most recent grant that's funded is through NICHD to go in and to collect information on their parenting of their children and on their children's outcomes. So we're going to have information on children's educational functioning, on their emotional behavioral functioning. I also got a small grant from within Duke to collect biological samples on some of these children as kind of a pilot study in order to kind of position us to collect biological samples like the blood spots on this next generation on the full sample. But right now I think we only have about 80 or so. Any other questions?
Here, it's Kate. I was struck by the data on gun ownership in the home and wondered if there are also attitudinal measures about things like gun control that one could explore as well. And I just wonder also if those, if you've seen any striking changes over time in the extent to which you see a presence of gun in the home.
Yeah, the measures that we collected were pretty cut and dried related to, do you have a gun? What kind of gun do you have? Handgun, long gun, or other, which is often the kind of semi-automatic, military type guns. But then we were interested in how it was stored and whether the child had access to it. And amazingly, there was a large portion of our sample, especially of the males that owned their own gun at age 9 when we got started working with them. So they not only had access, but they kind of had their own gun. We don't have some of their attitudes about guns, about kind of gun culture and everything else, but we have seen as they transition into adulthood, there's a lot of them that continue to be gun owners, since moving out of the home. So there's a lot of continuity in gun ownership across development. Yeah. And there's some really interesting analysis that we've recently done suggesting that gun access early on, even after you kind of account for some of the things that you think might kind of put kids at risk for later criminal behavior, seems to maybe have a role in gun-related crime in adulthood. Adjusting as best as we possibly can for those other factors that, that we might not have information on, right?
What portion of the cohort has seen military service?
I don't have the percentage with me, but it's a non-trivial amount. We do a lot of interviews that were kind of done over in the Gulf area and Afghanistan. We've had a lot of folks stationed around different parts of North Carolina and around the world. But it's not at all uncommon for our participants to view military service as being a pathway kind of forward for their careers and for their lives. Some of them have kind of served and then kind of come back, and some of them are kind of still serving.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you found in terms of adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a whole talk on that because when I kind of came into the study, and this was back in kind of 2004, one of the first things I wanted to do is to dive into this information that we had on early traumatic experiences for children. Not quite the same thing as ACEs. ACEs are kind of defined different ways depending upon different study. But we focused a lot on early traumatic experiences, and this includes, things like loss of a loved one, a life-threatening natural disaster, experiencing kind of physical abuse or sexual abuse, but all, events that we would kind of consider to be traumatic and likely to kind of cause distress and challenges for the child long term. Interestingly, when we looked at that within childhood, and this is after they'd already progressed to age 16, what surprised us is that over 60% of our sample reported an exposure to a traumatic event by the time they reached 16 years old. That surprised me. That seemed much higher than I expected. I can remember doing interviews at the time, and I talked to reporters and I'd walk through the list of events and they'd say, oh, actually, yeah, I do remember one of these occurring for me or for someone else that I knew. Since then, there's been kind of other studies like the National Comorbidity Study, Adolescent Supplement, which has kind of looked at lifetime trauma exposure, and their numbers are right at 60% as well. So it's a high level of exposure, and there's this kind of dose-dependent association between how many traumas you've been exposed to and the distress and the outcomes that are associated with that, both short-term within childhood, but then long-term into adulthood as well, such that, you know, the more trauma, the more distress and the poorer functioning in adulthood. There's no kind of, you know, kind of more provides some sort of habituation. It actually is kind of, you know, something where cumulative risk predicts kind of worse functioning. And so now one of the cool things we've been able to do with the study as well is we had those serial blood spots. We had folks that were exposed and reported traumatic events during the study, and we were able to go and to select a blood spot from before they reported trauma exposure, and then after they reported trauma exposure, and look at changes in methylation status at different points throughout the methylome, pre and post a traumatic event exposure. And that study is ongoing right now, but there's some really interesting findings, I think, about the lasting methylation-related signature of traumatic exposures. So it seems like there's some interest in getting into the data a little bit more. Want me to kind of move forward with that? Anyone else have a burning question? Okay. I think I'm going to test your tolerance for mental health today a little bit. I also have some slides presented on despair and opioid use, because that's something that we've been focused on a lot. But I think the work on mental health is the theme that kind of goes across GSMS. It's what the study was designed to look at. And I think the thing that we've kind of done best from the very beginning. And it's resulted in, I think, some important insights into, you know, mental health and how it plays out over the first 4 decades of life. So this is just looking at the prevalence, 3-month prevalence, snapshot at any given point in time of how common it is for a child to meet full criteria for a common psychiatric disorder: depression, anxiety, behavioral disorder, including conduct, ADHD, ODD, or substance disorder. So 13% means about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 kids at any point in time meet criteria. So if you're in a classroom full of kids, if there's kind of 20 kids in there, you might have 1 or 2. It seems relatively uncommon. You know, it's certainly not highly prevalent. What's interesting is the actual trajectory of these different categories is different, and it's different for every different type of disorder that we study. So if we look at something like the disruptive behavior disorders, this is conduct disorder and say ADHD, you can see that these are the most common throughout childhood and adolescence. And then they kind of fall off, or they seem to fall off dramatically into adulthood. There's kind of some interesting structural reasons why they fall off that much. When you're asking folks about their own conduct, they might be a little bit less reliable than when you ask their parents about these things, which is what we were doing before age 16. Anxiety disorders start out high here with separation anxiety. They're a little bit lower through adolescence, and then they increase, and we particularly see an increase in generalized anxiety and panic disorder as children transition into adulthood. Depression starts out as relatively uncommon pre-pubertally, and then the rates increase, they kind of double, particularly for females during puberty, and it stays high like that throughout adulthood. And then these huge spikes here that you see in green and yellow, that's the substance disorders, which kind of dwarf everything else during young adulthood. Interestingly, they fall about as quickly as they rise. And so one of the interesting questions for us is, who are the folks that continue in their substance use after everyone else is out of college or you know, moving on with their jobs or settling down or something like that? We really want to be able to understand and predict who are going to be the persistent substance users. So remember, we were saying that about 13% of folks met criteria for disorder at any given point in time. When we looked at it cumulatively, we get a very different answer to this question. So this is adding up the number of children that at any point in time ever met full criteria for a psychiatric disorder. What's interesting is that by the age of 16, it's almost 40% of the sample. By the age of 21, it's 60% of the sample that have met criteria for a full psychiatric disorder. The lighter orange bar on top here includes those folks that had significant symptoms and impairment related to those symptoms, but never met full criteria. So these would be considered sub-threshold cases, but it's negatively affecting some area of their life. And if you add them in as well, we see that it's over 80% of the sample has experienced some psychiatric related impairment by adulthood. So if you look at any given point in time, it looks like these things are relatively uncommon. If you look at this cumulatively, it seems like some sort of an emotional behavioral problem is a normative part of development in this sample. And since this data has been out there, there's other studies that have shown similar high rates if you look at this cumulatively. I think that this is an important insight. Mental health is just like physical health. We all get hit by something at some point in time, and most of us by the time we reach adulthood. Unfortunately, a lot of folks aren't getting help. So this is looking at the rate of service use, but then importantly, conditional rate of service use. So this is conditional on meeting criteria for a psychiatric disorder. What is your likelihood of getting any mental health services in the community? And it turns out in childhood, it's about a coin flip, whether you get anything or not, okay? So there's a high level of unmet need when it comes to these types of mental health problems. Interestingly, that's as good as it gets, because once you move out of your parents' house and once you transition into adulthood, the conditional rate falls to 25%. And the reason why that is, of course, is because most of the reason that these folks are getting the services they're getting is because of their parents, and it's because of their teachers. And a lot of the time, those folks may not be playing that same role when they reach adulthood. So the level of unmet need is that much higher. That makes sense? Okay. So next, what we wanted to do is to really kind of link up these early mental health experiences with their functioning in adulthood, because now we've followed them 19, 21, 25, 30, 35 years old. We've got a lot of data on them in adulthood. So we divided up the sample based upon their childhood mental health status. 36% that met criteria for a full disorder, another 21% with the subthreshold, and 43% that did not meet the criteria for a disorder. And this is up to age 16. And then we followed them up to look at their functioning in these different important areas of adult functioning: health, criminal behavior, wealth, educational, financial functioning, and social functioning. And what we did at each point for each scale is we included a number of different indicators. This is just a partial list of the types of things that we would include in these scales, and created scales, and then we standardized the score so we can say, what does having a mental health disorder in childhood tell us about your functioning in health, in criminality, in wealth, and in social functioning in adulthood? Does that make sense? Okay. And here's what we found. And I think that this is a really interesting figure. So remember, we standardized these results, and higher scores indicate improved functioning in these different domains that I was just describing to you. The column on the left is the folks that never met criteria for a psychiatric disorder. And across all four of these categories, they're doing the best. The middle category is those that only met criteria for a subthreshold disorder, and they almost disappear because they're almost right at a standardized score of 0, but they're kind of right along the middle here. And then our psychiatric cases are the worst off in all these areas. So there almost appears to be this kind of dose-dependent association between childhood mental health status and adult outcomes. And this was even after we adjusted for all of the other sort of psychosocial experiences, which we know can be associated with adult functioning: childhood trauma, adversity, and other sort of family hardships. If we break this out to look at the number of different disorders that they met criteria for, we can see that that dose-dependent relationship just extends outward. The more disorders, the more impaired they were, and it held across all of these different domains. There were some kind of outcomes that were specific to different disorders, but this is what it looked like overall. Does this make sense? Are there any questions about this? We then wanted to follow up and say, what about if we just focus not on normal functioning with these scales, but maybe on those outcomes that would really indicate someone's been derailed in their transition from childhood to adulthood, the kind of stuff that it's harder to bounce back from, like multiple mental health problems or suicidality or a life-threatening physical health event or serious criminal behavior. And do these categories still tell us something about risk for these, what we call critical outcomes? And it's a pretty similar story with higher levels of risk in a dose-dependent manner for any of these outcomes and more than one of these outcomes. And again, it seems like the more disorders that a person has had in childhood, their higher overall mental health burden, the kind of worse off they are and the more likely they are to have one of these critical outcomes. So there's one more piece of the story. After seeing this data, what we were thinking is, boy, it would be fantastic if we could actually treat these problems in childhood and forestall all of these poor outcomes in adulthood. You know, there is this hypothesis out there that if we can effectively treat it early, then we can prevent later problems. And that's what we wanted to test. Does treatment of these problems in childhood actually help prevent the burden of disease in adulthood? And when you study a sample for this long, we kind of have the natural experiment built in to kind of test this. And the reason why is because we have a large group of people that have had a psychiatric disorder in childhood, and we have a portion of that sample that have received some sort of specialty mental health services in the community. So they've seen a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a licensed social worker. And what we wanted to test is seeing that service provider, is that going to be helpful? And is that going to protect you against some of these long-term effects of these disorders? Okay. Now, in order to do this analysis, we'd be comparing those with just a child disorder to those that had both a disorder and service use. And you have to account for all the different reasons why people get services to begin with. And we wrote more of that literature than almost anybody else. I mean, they have more symptoms, they have more impairments, different insurance status than those that don't get services. And so we used a propensity score model where we were able to balance all of these different reasons why kids get referred for mental health services to create samples that were reasonably comparable in terms of those that just had a disorder and those that had a disorder plus service use. Does that make sense? And what we were looking to do is to kind of test the causal question, does service use protect you against some of the adult outcomes? And here we looked at having any adult psychiatric problem, any adult emotional disorder, and any adult substance disorder. And unfortunately, what we see is that actually the group that received services still has actually higher rates of these problems, not significantly so, than the group that didn't receive services. But actually, over in the substance category, it is almost significantly higher. And if you look at the group of kids that just had a childhood behavioral disorder, conduct disorder, ADHD, we actually do see that those that received services were actually worse off in terms of their risk for substance disorders later on. And there's some folks that on the call that could probably explain much better than I, some of the reasons why those services might not be effective and might actually be kind of problematic. There's a literature about, you know, some of the problematic effects of services, particularly in the case of childhood behavioral disorders. But I realize that time is flying right now, and I wanted to get to kind of the future of the study a little bit too. But are there any questions on this data portion here? It's okay. This is a lot of work, and I think probably makes up a series of 10 or 15 papers altogether that have kind of gone out over the years. And I'm happy to share details about any portion of this with anybody that's interested, you know, and direct you in the right way. So I'm going to skip over despair and opioids for the time being, because I see that, you know, we don't have as much time, and talk to you a little bit about where we are and where we're going, okay? And so I mentioned this earlier, but the most recent grant that we're funded on, that Dr. Dodge is the PI on, is this intergenerational effect study where we follow the participants and we learn about their parenting and we learn about their children's outcomes. And we're specifically doing that in the context of trying to understand the effects of this cash transfer I discussed to the Cherokee members on their offspring. But then we're also interested in more general questions about the intergenerational continuity of mental health problems, risk, and resilience. There simply aren't a lot of studies that have followed a cohort like this over a long enough period of time and then has similar information on the children that they had on the parents. And so there's a lot of, I think, basic descriptive work that we can do. That data collection is ongoing. We're planning on collecting data through the end of June of next year. And fingers crossed based upon a wonderful new search tool, but we're on track to have a very, a good level of participation for the participants that are still living, even 28 years after they originally started with the study. So we're excited about that and excited about some of the data that's going to come out from that. And perhaps Ken can talk a little bit about that after this here. The next future part is transitioning Smoky Mountain Study, which has been about child mental health and about development and about substance use, to being a study about rural aging. And so there is a application that's currently under review. It focuses on a full assessment of their health risk, cognitive, social, and economic functioning. What we want to do is really to get a baseline for a lot of the processes that are interesting across the aging process that our participants are just starting to age into. We also want to kind of do a real deep dive in terms of understanding everyday life and context of adults in rural Appalachia. So there's a portion of this where we're going to go in and to collect information on a regular basis every other week about their everyday life over a 6-month period. We wanted to do kind of a year in the life of living and aging in rural Appalachia. It's a little bit expensive to do a full year, so we're doing 6 months. So we're doing this EMA type survey. We're also going to be collecting actigraphy, information about physical activity and sleep. We're also going to be doing geolocating so we can understand their kind of zone of movement within their communities and kind of match this up with measures that are collected in Dr. Cagney's activity space study from Chicago. So we're excited about that. Another key part is to make this maximally useful in terms of aging. We want to harmonize the newly collected data with a number of key aging studies, including things like NSHAP and activity space and some things with HRS, but also with Add Health, which isn't so much an aging study, but is a study that actually has participants which are about the same age as the GSMS participants. So we've kind of worked together on a couple of analyses with Add Health Group. And we want to allow comparisons to be made between GSMS and some of these other samples. And then we also want to finally fund and to support a more comprehensive data sharing program so that it's not just a study with the same kind of band of folks on every publication, but it kind of is used more broadly by other researchers of human development, of aging, and so on and so forth. So we're kind of building in some of the infrastructure to do that as well. And we're hoping that this idea—
collect measures of physical function?
Yes, yeah. So as part of this, we would be collecting some of the physical measures that we've historically collected, right? Including, our blood spots again, including, height, weight, and blood pressure and pulmonary function and some other things. We also want to do a kind of broader physical health assessment of them. And we're also, as I mentioned before, kind of getting permission for health records too. So we can
I'm talking about physical performance, physical function, like gait speed or grip strength or things of that nature.
Right. So there is going to be, as part of this kind of a cognitive assessment, I don't think that we have a whole lot in terms of some of the measures that you're talking about in terms of, strength or speed or mobility. We want to kind of add those in as the study ages and we have a little bit more variability, I think. In this
but it would be I would suggest that you think seriously about doing it now, so you have that baseline at younger age to compare with the older age group as they age.
Yeah. And I think our participants really enjoy doing some of those kind of active, little protocols as well. So that, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Other questions about where we're at, where we're going? I'm just gonna, this is the new team. This is that working on the aging project. We're hopeful that we're gonna get a chance to kind of move forward with that. I also wanna mention, importantly, a lot of the other collaborators that have been a part of GSMS over the years. And importantly, this person over here on the right, this is Lily Shanahan. She and I were postdocs with Jane and Adrian at the same time in 2004, which is, I guess, kind of like going through boot camp together, It's this, kind of intense and stressful situation, and so you're bonded. And so we've continued to work together for the last 15 years on this wonderful data set, even as she's kind of moved to the University of Zurich. The project has been funded by a lot of grants over time, and we're very grateful to the participants, their parents, and there's this really amazing staff that keeps the study going, finds the participants, and will not let up. So for those of you that know Dr. Costello, Jane is a force of nature, and she kind of made GSMS happen in this extraordinary way. And Wanda is almost her equal. You put them together, and I think they can just about run the world. So they've really kind of made this thing go from the very beginning. So that's all I've got.
So just to go back for a second on the physical measures and physical function measures, if you should decide you want to think more about that, our Claude Pepper Center here at Duke has a lot of expertise in that area. We've been working with the Dunedin study folks to incorporate those sort of measures in that study, and it's been very, very valuable. They're a little older and been going a little longer, but the same principle. So if you're interested, I'd be glad to connect you with we have a physical measurement core within the Pepper Center.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely.
Time
I don't know,
from everybody.
oh, sorry, I don't want to interrupt.
No, I was inviting people to ask questions.
Yeah.
Anything you want. Bill, can you also, maybe you and Ken together, I know that there is a collaboration between GSMS and Fast Track, and that is sort of, it's kind of becoming sort of a multi-site study of intergenerational transmission of, sort of disadvantage sort of in other aspects. So can you, talk a bit about that, or maybe Ken? Because that is, sort of interesting to think, especially when you're thinking about a study that is a community, I mean, I don't call it community study, but again, it's based on a population that is geographically sort of constrained. It's important also to think about the opportunity to expand to multiple sites, by collaborating with other studies that are already ongoing, or sort of we're thinking about representativeness. It's clearly representative at the local level, but again, any efforts that have been undertaken so far, sort of in extending to multiple sites, sort of that are of interest also to the community of population population students and population scientists.
I'm glad to take that one up, Bill. Give you a little break. So yeah, thank you. This is a collaboration that does mean coming together of the assessment protocols for one. So we are following up the offspring of the participants in GSMS and the offspring of participants in a quite separate fast-track randomized control trial. Those offspring are now anywhere from, we're assessing them 5 to 15 years of age, whatever, with identical protocols. So we will have the potential for putting participants together across these studies. In addition to the participants that Bill described, the fast track study includes participants from 4 different geographic sites across the country, Durham, North Carolina being one, Nashville, Tennessee being a second, Seattle, Washington being a third, and then rural central Appalachian, Pennsylvania being the fourth. The first hypothesis that we are examining is really quite simple and quite important, I think. That is that each of these 2 studies has involved an intervention and an evaluation of that intervention. So in Fast Track, it was a randomized controlled trial whereby children, as they entered first grade, high-risk, aggressive children were identified and randomly assigned to intervention or control. We implemented the intervention. The intervention had a positive impact on reducing disruptive behavior disorders, aggressive behavior problems, chronic violence, even lowering arrest rates for those randomly assigned to the intervention. In the GSMS, there's a different kind of intervention that Bill alluded to, which is the sudden bringing in of the casinos, which led to cash transfer that by the papers Bill and Jane have written has shown a positive impact on reducing the disruptive behavior disorders, conduct problems in those children. So now the children from both of those studies grow up and become adults and have children. We know there is significant cross-generational continuity in this pattern of disruptive behavior problems. The science believes that it's some combination of genetic factors that carry across generations, as well as environmental factors about culture, about parenting, about socialization. So now we ask a simple hypothesis. If through exogenous intervention, whether it's this cash transfer or direct intervention in parenting and child skill training, we reduce disruptive behavior, will that reduction carry into the next generation? Or will the next generation recapitulate the original disruptive behavior problems from the prior generation? And we can put together plausible hypotheses on either end of that, right? A genetic plausible hypothesis is that through intervention, you can mask disruptive behavior, or through a lot of cash to a family, you can make them look better and be better for a period of time. But whatever underlying factors led to their disruptive behavior problems in the first place will carry over into the next generation. Alternately, an entirely environmental mediation hypothesis would say if you can disrupt that or interrupt that disruptive behavior problem and make them better functioning adults, which we have through lower arrest rates, higher employment rates, that sort of thing, and make them better parents, then you will interrupt the cross-generational continuity. So we're testing that. That's one of the things we're testing. We're also testing a lot of descriptive processes of cross-generational continuity. It's taken 3 years to collect the data. We're almost done and chomping at the bit to do data analyses. So we don't have any findings on these questions yet.
Okay. I'm just seeing whether there are any questions in the chat. Should I read one of the questions? Since you are interested in the context of participant lives, have you considered a qualitative sub-study Or does the EMA study include that? That's from Suzanne Zietz.
Yeah, I can respond to that. At different points in time, we have kind of collaborated with other folks that have done that kind of a qualitative, sub-study of some of our participants. So Ken was describing the cash transfer and some of the beneficial effects that that had for children of families that received those extra funds. And we had an anthropologist that we were working with down at Emory that came up and did in-depth interviews with a number of the members of the tribe, and also did some measures on their life goals and obstacles that they saw for those life goals. So wanted to take kind of a life course perspective on, does this kind of little leg up that they were getting affect the way that they view their future, the things that they value, and their view of their likelihood of kind of getting those things, down the road. So there have been, kind of some of these, I think kind of probably more qualitative sub-studies that have kind of gone on throughout it. We've done some in-depth interviews with some of the folks that have experienced some of the, I would say, more challenging early life trajectories as well. There isn't anything kind of built in for this most recent, wave to do that. We're kind of always, working with and kind of collaborating with others around that. But I think it's a rich sample for some of that work.
There is another question. Does the study have information on ADHD separate from other disruptive behavior problems?
That's an easy one. Yes. So full diagnostic interview, and there's a module for attention problems and kind of related features as well that we've been kind of collecting since the very beginning of the study, and continued to collect as folks transition into adulthood as well. It's the participants reporting on themselves. In childhood, we had information from their parents too. But yeah, ADHD has been a part of the study since the beginning. And in fact, we were able, because we're kind of out there in the community, to address some early questions. This is going to be kind of thinking back a long time for some of us. But, back in the late 90s, early aughts, there was this question about our children kind of being overprescribed stimulants. And we had information in the community about ADHD. We had information in the community about stimulant treatment. And so we were able to go in there and to look at that and to see that for some portions of our sample, there was evidence that kids that didn't necessarily meet full criteria were getting stimulant treatment, and that was associated with higher levels of SES. And on the other end of the scale, there was folks that were in impoverished families where the kids had ADHD and were not getting, any sort of treatment at all, much less psychostimulants. So the answer it seemed to be that there was some overprescription and some underprescription that was kind of going on, depending upon where you kind of fell in this SES scale.
There is a next question, which I actually like, and this was sort of one of the reasons why we decided really to, invite, the PIs of these large studies, wanted to see whether, new collaborations, also with students, sort of can be sort of spearheaded. And so the next question is, if someone is interested in using the data, who should they contact to see if collaboration is an option? And I know that you're working on sort of a data sharing protocol, and you're working with University of Michigan, but even before you get to, with ICPSR, but before you get to that, I mean, are there sort of any?
Yeah, there's a limited amount of data in ICPSR right now. It's not the whole, amount of information that folks would be looking for. What we've always found is pretty successful is for folks to kind of contact the study team directly. And oftentimes, for students, we ask them to kind of put together a prospectus of what their idea is, what's the question, what are the variables, what would be kind of a little timeline and plan. And then that can kind of be circulated amongst the team and kind of approved, and a data set can be provided to them. So if there's anyone that's interested in kind of collaborating, I would just encourage them to kind of reach out to me, and we can kind of start that process. And I'd be excited to, kind of talk about different ideas that folks have. I will put my email address in the chat there. But the short story is I have a lot of email addresses, and even if you send it to my Duke address, it gets to me. So no problems there.
You're also an external affiliate of Dupree, so you still, and you are affiliated still with the Department of Psychiatry here, right? In some fashion.
And the Center for Child and Family.
Yeah, and right.
Well, yeah. Lots of times I go up to my office here, and then I'll have 3 or 4 conference calls in a row with folks from Durham. So I still kind of spend a lot of time collaborating with a lot of folks there.
Can I ask an additional question? Hi,
Please.
it's Naomi again. I'm just wondering what you found in terms of the concordance of adversity, looking at the respondents and now their children, and the types of resilience that you looked at or that you measure in the study.
Are you asking specifically about the intergenerational data?
Yeah, or the possibilities, I guess. So sometimes in the medical field, we talk about measuring ACEs, but then we think about taking a step back and talking to parents about their experience in childhood and whether there's an intergenerational piece for ACEs as well.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that was kind of an important part of how we kind of designed the data collection protocol for the intergenerational study. And we're going to have a lot of that information on the offspring of the participants in terms of their exposure to kind of a broad range of negative life events that kind of goes, I think, a little bit broader than the ACEs category in general. And then through the CAPA structured interview, we have, I think it's close to 30 or 40 different events that we collect information on the participants when they were children. So Naomi, we don't have the data in hand yet to look at that kind of concordance in terms of ACEs or trauma across the generations, but we're going to have it by the middle of next year. And I think that's kind of an important, studying these early adverse events and their kind of long-term effects within the person's life has kind of been, I think, a theme of what we've done with GSMS over time. Now being able to do that intergenerationally is something that's a high priority. But no data just yet.
Anyone else?